Welcome to The Roll Forward, a podcast for the next wave of finance leaders, especially those looking to transform their roles by making smarter, faster, and more profitable business decisions using the power of technology and a forward-looking approach to finance. Listen in to learn how to get out of the back office trenches and become a more strategic partner within your organization.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Roll Forward podcast. My name is Joe Michalowski, and this episode is brought to you by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. And today, our guest is Matt Wolf. He is the CFO of ChartHop, a people analytics company that is creating more connected organizations. Matt, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here.
Awesome. I love getting through, the intro spiel, but we have a pretty good topic lined up for today. I'm excited about it. But before we get to it, I want to start off with just a quick background on yourself. Can you give everybody like the quick rundown of who you are, the work that you do at ChartHop, and kind of how you got there?
Sure thing. So as you mentioned, I'm currently the CFO at ChartHop, which is a people analytics platform. Prior to that, I was the CFO at another SaaS company, did a few other startups prior to that, and began my career as an investment banker in a prior life.
Nice. We did an ebook one time that was like who your first finance hire should be as a startup.
Right.
And there were like 4 personas, and one of them was like the investment banker, and one of them was like the accountant. So now that's just drilled in my head. I'm always curious like what the person is going to say, like which background they came from.
Which drop down, which option
exactly.
they'll select. Yeah.
We haven't failed yet. I haven't gotten anyone coming out of left field being like, I was a history major and I did X, Y, and Z. It's been pretty solid.
Really consistent. Yeah, sure. Makes sense.
Awesome. Well, great to have you here. We're going to be talking about organizational transparency today, which I'm going to be honest, it's a different topic than normally we cover. A lot of finance topics, just it's a little outside the realm of like the numbers and the business partnering. And so we really want to focus on how finance and HR teams kind of come together to foster organizational transparency. But that term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So can you just talk about what organizational transparency means to you and the kind of framing of what we'll talk about it as?
Yeah, happy to do that. So I think the way that I look at organizational transparency is ensuring that our employees have a really clear view of what the company's strategy, how the company is performing. We do share financials with our company, with our employees, kind of pretty broadly, which I think is somewhat rare in some organizations. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I think they can be hard to digest sometimes. And so we do a lot of work around making sure that things are in fact adjustable. A lot of kind of teach-ins one-on-one, making ourselves available, frankly, to answer questions, to kind of sort of foster that. And then I think, the other piece is that sometimes management tends to want to keep, employees in the dark on certain things. And I don't think that always works very well. We don't do that here at ChartHop, and I think we do quite the opposite, as I was saying. But I think in some instances, it may signal that management sometimes is a little unsure of the numbers themselves, or unsure of their performance, or frankly unsure how to talk about it. And I think it actually makes us better as a management team by having to talk about it to the organization, explain performance, explain the strategy, and really having to distill it down so that everyone in an organization can understand it. It forces us to understand it better as well.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. We talk a lot about, financial storytelling for the board and for executive teams and kind of the making the business grow side. And it just doesn't often get brought up how we need to foster that internally as well. And at Mosaic, that's what the leadership team has done here as well. We have like our own like Mosaic company. You can go in, you can see like how we're trending towards our numbers. So very much top of mind for us as well. So I'm really excited we're going to dive into this, and thank you for the definition. But, if you get like a rundown of what company values are, if you just see every company's value, I feel like foster transparency or cultivate transparency will probably show up like all the time. It's a very common company value, but it's not easy to do. And I feel like a lot of companies, even though they say it, maybe don't actually like effectively put it in place. So I'm curious what some of the challenges are. I know you're talking about distilling that story for the people in the company, but what are some of the other challenges you face as a CFO and as a leadership team to actually make this happen?
Yeah, I think, one of the things is that it's hard to do. Like, how do you share these things? Is it through slides? Is it through, data tables or whatever else? And then what does kind of organizational transparency really mean? And it goes beyond just the numbers as well. It's what are reporting lines look like? How are teams structured? What are comp bands? And that's actually one of the challenges that ChartHop seeks to solve as a platform, which is making that information available to organizations. And so I think, we certainly use our own product internally. So there's a lot of internal feedback. And so I think we're in a very fortunate position to have that tool available to us and really kind of being on the cutting edge of it. But I think it is one of the challenges. How do you present all of these different sort of facets of information of a company in a sort of consistent and consolidated way so that people know where to look? A lot of times, people will say that someone's available, but they're not quite sure where to look for it. And having it in a single platform makes that very easy.
Yeah, for sure. I think if people are listening, I feel like maybe company culture and culture building doesn't often fall on the plate of finance, or it's not stereotypically what you would see finance's role as. So, I mean, the way you're talking about it, it's very numbers driven, but I think people would still expect this to be like a CEO responsibility mainly. So I'm curious, like, if these are the challenges, like what is finance's broader role in cultivating transparency? How do you work with your CEO? I know we're going to get to HR, but what is finance's role here, and how can finance leaders think about their role a bit differently than maybe they have in the past?
Yeah, I think I think historically finance has been looked at in an organization as accounting in a lot of ways, accounting and planning. And I think HR teams also were looked at as sort of an adjacency to management as opposed to kind of serving the needs of the company. I think that's starting to shift. I think that has shifted in a lot of ways. And so one of the things that I really try to focus on is, especially with my own team, is getting them out of sort of the back office, if you will. I mean, we're all remote, so it's a figure of speech, but is making sure that our teams are interacting with, or my team is interacting with the other teams in the company. And as you said, kind of it starts with interaction between the CEO. I think kind of sort of trickles down in an organization. And I, from a finance perspective, make sure that gets into my team as well. And then that they are interacting in ways that are consistent with that culture across the team. So whether it's following up on billing or something like that, or asking questions about vendors, I think in some sort of that kind of the traditional view of accounting or of planning, it's sort of a very cold function. And I think my view of it is that it really just needs to be another strategic arm of the business. All of these things kind of point to my sort of philosophy around finance, which is it is making sure that resources are available to the organization, whether those are, that's obviously financial resources, human resources. And then what are teams doing to kind of foster that culture within an, is there a budget for that? Am I reminding teams when we're talking about budgets that, hey, we probably want to allocate some spend to making sure that teams are collaborating and getting together and things like that.
I love that. I'm going to go off on a little tangent because you didn't hear it because we don't run it at the beginning of the actual recording. But if you've listened to an episode of our podcast, there's like a little intro kind of talk track about getting like finance out of the back office trenches and making them more strategic. So we are very much in line with kind of making finance that more strategic role in the business.
Yeah.
But I'm curious if that's something that has evolved for you over your career, or if you've always, like, did you always come to your roles with that thought, or were you also in that kind of accounting role and realized maybe that wasn't working out the way you wanted it to and had to change?
So I think my background sort of influenced how I came about it. So as I mentioned, I came from an investment banking background, which is a very sort of consultative role. There's a very transactional nature to it, but there's a lot of just human interaction because you're working on either buying or selling companies or taking companies public, things like that. So you're working with management teams in pretty high stakes scenarios sometimes. And so you have to learn how to be a strategic partner. And so when I sort of shifted my career from that, that aspect of it into more operational roles, I took that with me. And so from the start, it was important to me that the organizations that I was joining viewed finance as a strategic function within the business, as opposed to just a team that kind of spits out numbers every month and we look at them and then kind of move on from there. And so I think it certainly has come from my own background as a strategic partner to other companies, and then bringing that mentality and that philosophy internally.
Yeah, I love that. We've always talked about it as like a finance as the customer service organization for the business.
Yeah.
And so like, you're not just kind of doing ad hoc requests for everyone, but you're acting as like kind of the customer success role, kind of supporting everything that everybody else needs.
Yeah.
So I love that. But it's like it'd be really easy to say, oh, the traditional role of finance is like scorekeepers in the background, so there are blind spots for how they could culture or cultivate transparency. If you're talking about kind of like this nice blend of numbers driven and strategic partnership driven, it seems like you kind of have everything covered. I'm curious if there are any challenges that finance isn't as equipped to handle as far as cultivating transparency goes. Like, where do you need help in this case?
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue into kind of how we interact with the people team. And I
Yep.
think part of why I like to think I've been quite successful at that in the organization I've worked with. I actually my previous role was running HR for the first year. I came
Oh,
there
wow.
as finance hire and kind of picked up a lot of things that weren't staff, and so it was everything from finance and accounting, obviously, but legal, IT, facilities,
Yes.
HR. We eventually brought in a wonderful HR professional to lead the team, but I maintained a very close relationship with her as she scaled the team, and kind of we just worked very very well together. But I got to see sort of the people side from managing that part of the business and not just being a partner to it. And so I think there's a certain level of understanding that I had just I'm fortunate to have because of some of the responsibilities I've had at other organizations. And I think finance, to your point, being very numbers driven, you can get a little bit bogged down in that or kind of caught up in that. And I try to look at it from a much more empathetic perspective than I think might be sort of expected in terms of how we partner, how we talk to, and how we engage with other parts of the company, other parts of the team. It's I think sometimes you look at finance teams and they are sort of thought of as like spend police, and it's like, well, I'm trying to
Yep.
get something done here, and they're just saying no. I don't like to say no. I have my responsibilities, but at the same time, I like to find creative solutions in sort of collaborative ways to solve problems. And so it's like it's usually if it is a no, we can't do something. It's no, but can we do this, or can we do this later, or is there another way here? And so I think when I think about how we interact with other teams and especially the people team, it's really understanding what are the actual needs, what are the pain points of teams beyond just they are asking for something, for example, outside of budget. Well, it goes beyond that because there's a reason they're asking for it. There's a reason that the organization has that demand. And let's talk about it. Let's understand it.
How does this look in practice? I want to get to some examples in a little bit, but I mean like if you're talking about, let's say you're talking about I mean, we're coming up now, it's July as we're recording this. Like we're coming up on annual planning season.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at this point, planning season is kind of like all the time because
Yeah.
times are rough.
Well,
But
yeah.
regardless,
Yeah.
so if you're like going into budgeting meetings or planning meetings, like does this benefit you in that way because you have this relationship with HR? Like where does this pop up from an execution standpoint, and how does that impact kind of your day to day as a CFO?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the way I sort of look at it is when we go into planning sessions, one, I tend to approach it from the perspective of whatever we spent in the past is sort of irrelevant because one, it's a fast growing company and it's not the kind of traditional budget process. Well, you had X last year, let's increase it by this or decrease it. And did you use it? Did you not use it? I look at it. I go into a planning meeting and I say, okay, here are sort of what we're trying to achieve on the top line or certain company goals for next year. What do you need from a marketing, sales, engineering team, whatever it is, to achieve this goal? And having built those relationships that goes beyond just the numbers, and understanding who the people are on teams, how the teams are organized, and again, not to go back to ChartHop again, but knowing how teams are literally organized and being able to see them and knowing who's in charge of what and knowing what they're working on, knowing who's even whether it's tenure or whatever data you're trying to look for, you can get a perspective on the business that you don't normally have. And so taking that information into a planning meeting gives you just that much more context for when people are asking for things or justifying things or asking for feedback on whether or not they should do something. You can be, again, going back to this sort of strategic partner just because you have that much more understanding of the business.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, if you're going into a meeting and you have to start with the baseline of, hey, what does your team actually look like? It's a little less
Right.
productive than starting 7 steps ahead of that and actually getting to talk about what the needs of the team are. So I think it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we talked about kind of finances role, we talked about how you interact with the people team. I'm curious, just super quick question. Does HR roll up to you as the CFO at ChartHop? I've heard different people structure it a little differently. So I guess just for people listening, what does that actually look like organizational wise for you?
It does not at ChartHop. Our VP people rolls up to our CEO. So there's a separate
Okay,
reporting line, and obviously on the exec team, though.
gotcha. Does that impact? I know you said you owned HR at one point in previous roles.
Mhm.
Does How has that impacted kind of the way you approach this organizational transparency? Has it made it more difficult not being the one that this person reports to? I'm sure you talk all the time anyway. Does it
Oh,
really
yeah.
matter in the end, like what
Um,
like the roll up
I,
looks like?
yeah, I don't think it does. And there's a couple of things there's a couple of reasons for that. One, as I said earlier, kind of everything structure goes up from the top. And so with the CEO, Narkiski, and setting culture, I think is in, absolutely the right direction. The management team is very well aligned on that.
Yep.
And we also have, a small group of execs that really do focus on that specific aspect. So there's a lot of communication. And so I don't think the reporting lines really make a difference at all.
Gotcha. Cool. I mean that's great. I mean, honestly, it so much of what we talk about on this podcast, guests I've had in the past, it's the CEO CFO relationship is like the most critical one you have, and then after that, it's pretty close second to pretty much any functional business partner, like at the
Mhm.
executive level. So I guess like what you're saying is as long as that executive level in its entirety is aligned, then you are going to be all set to kind of make your way down this path of cultivating transparency.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
that starts with the exec team. Is that team transparent with each other? And if it is, great, and everyone feels comfortable, everyone feels confident saying things. You can have difficult conversations with and
yep.
among the exec team where if it's more siloed in other organizations, that makes that challenging, and that's also going to sort of fall into the organization. But if the organization believes that the exec team is coordinated, all rowing in the same direction, to use an overly used phrase. But I think if they believe that they are coordinated and aligned and they trust each other, and that's also ultimately what it comes down to. That's where the transparency really gets to. Is like, do I trust this organization? Do I trust this
Yep.
management team? And yes, I trust them. And one of the reasons I trust them is like I see what is going on, and what I see is consistent with what I'm being told. And so I think that's a huge piece of it.
Makes a ton of sense. I want to drill down and get specific about like what this looks like at ChartHop. So we talked a little bit about planning, but at the beginning you talked about, making sure that people had access to the information and knew where to find it and, just making sure that the right data was shared in the right ways.
Mhm.
I'm curious like what that actually looks like day to day. If I'm an employee at ChartHop and I'm saying like, wow, ChartHop is very transparent with me as an employee base,
Yep.
what are some ways from an execution standpoint that you are making that clear to your employees?
Yeah, I'll give you a very specific example. So we have a number of KPIs that we track across the company. We
Yep.
update them on a weekly basis, and our sort of cadence is that we have an exec meeting once a week, and then following that we have an all hands meeting with everyone in the company. We do this weekly. I think even just having a weekly all hands, that cadence
Wow.
just increases the transparency, and they're incredibly well attended. So that's always great to see. But to get back to your example, we have a shared file,
Yep.
which we update every morning or every week, excuse me, that we then comment on how we're tracking towards a specific goal for a quarter or for a year. We then talk about that in our exec meeting, and then we then share that exact same sheet in the all hands meeting. And that sheet's accessible to everyone in the company at any point in time. So there's never any question of what is our goal for the quarter, how are we tracking on a weekly basis, and what is management's view of the current position relative to the end of the quarter. And so I think that access, and there's a number of KPIs. It's not a handful. There's a lot. It's really specific by team. You see who's the owner of that goal. You see who's responsible for tracking the data, and then you see the evaluation that we have on a weekly basis, and that's shared throughout the company.
Wow. I'm gonna be honest, that's intense. I've
Right.
been at a handful of my own company. Like you guys clearly commit to transparency. Like that's amazing. It's great that you provide all this information. What's the feedback like? I mean, I'm sure a lot of people come to ChartHop and they experience this for the first time. They're like, oh, like I have not been
Yeah.
at a company that is so willing to share this. Have you heard from employees about what they appreciate about this?
our sort of weekly all hands Zoom calls, as we're going through information, I bet if we were able to pull the data from kind of the Zoom chat while we're doing it, the number one comment would be thanks for the transparency. They do respond to this. They see it on a weekly basis, and we really do let them into management decisions, as I said, KPI tracking, obviously, and really start to really try to explain why we made a certain decision, and let them know that we've been thoughtful about how we've approached something. So it isn't just kind of a quick decision that someone made. There's a process behind it. And so again, I think the response from employees broadly is again, it's there's an appreciation of that transparency, and you get comments to your point exactly, which is I've never seen this level of transparency at an organization before. And I think,
Yeah, that's amazing. Love that. I want to I don't want to go too negative because this is a really positive conversation,
sure.
and I will get to benefits and kind of advice that you might have for people trying to set this up. But before we get there, I want to take it from another side, which is like, are there any challenges you experience because you are so transparent? So I'm guessing like if there's a skeptic that is listening and they're like, we need to be kind of this company that is a little more buttoned up. You mentioned it earlier, people that are not willing to share kind of that information. What are some roadblocks you've hit? Maybe tough questions you've had to
Yeah.
answer, things that have come up because you are so willing to share this information.
Well, I think it's just that there are tougher questions because you are sharing information and people are interpreting that information. And as I said in the beginning, it forces you to kind of really tighten up the narrative around a certain decision, around a number, or whatever it happens to be. And so that can be challenging because it's things that, as a management team, sometimes you can just assume that everyone understands and you can kind of move beyond it. If you're sharing that more broadly, you need to be very, very kind of tight about how you are explaining something and be prepared for the fact that not everyone's going to have the same understanding, have the same perspective, the same background, and try to anticipate how people will interpret something. And so there's an additional level of sort of thought that goes into, okay, we're going to share this piece of information. How do we think an org will respond to this? And so I think for organizations that are looking to increase transparency, it's to be prepared for that. It's not just, okay, we've made things available, and now let's see what happens. Like, what's going to happen is you're going to get a bunch of questions because you're things that people may not have seen them in previous organizations. It may be something that people weren't expecting. And I think as long as you are, as I said earlier, kind of sharing the thought process or explaining things, then it all makes sense. But it's not enough to just share a piece of data, because at that point it is just data. And what are people supposed to do with that data, and is there information there?
Yeah, it's definitely kind of getting to that why behind the numbers, the same way
Yep.
you have to like make a narrative for your investors and kind of
Yep.
understand what the direction is, doing that for the employees. Because obviously, if somebody came out of this and you're like, oh, I should just share all the information with my employees, like, cool, here's a dashboard. There are the numbers, guys. Like, there you go.
Right.
Enjoy. That's probably going to be more harm than
What's
good for all
interesting there is
involved.
you start to see where people kind of focus.
Yeah.
You have this much broader sort of group of folks that are looking at something, and you start to see how certain people think about one number. That may not be the way that you as a management team are thinking about it, because you have a bunch of other context or whatever. But it really does then force you to think, okay, well, they're looking at it this way. How are, to your point, investors or whoever or the board going to look at something? And I think there's that initial roadblock or the initial sort of speed bump to say, okay, wow, we really need to kind of think about how we explain things. But once you get over that, that also just becomes part of the process. And that, I think, makes you, as an exec team, better at sort of explaining the company, and
Yeah.
whether it's performance or a decision.
That what you just said about kind of having those extra eyes and kind of getting all those different perspectives on the numbers, it's really interesting. It kind of makes me wonder, have you adjusted kind of if we roll back to working with HR, are there things you've taken back because of like the additional questions you've gotten and tried to adjust maybe strategy around benefits or things like that? Like, what has this brought to you as a company because you get all those different perspectives, I guess?
So I think there are two things. So when you say taken back, do you mean have we presented something that we shouldn't be showing it again?
No. I mean, like, take back as in, like, you present some information, you get all this feedback, and now, like, we're done with all hands, and we take that information back, we
Understood. Yeah.
discuss it internally.
Yeah.
So,
So we do a lot of surveying of our employees to kind of get that feedback for certain decisions
yep.
that we're making, and it's something that we do discuss as an exec team on a pretty regular basis. Feedback is taken very seriously, and I think our employees would agree with that. We have made adjustments to benefits. We have made adjustments to compensation, and all of those things happen because we've gotten feedback, and I think just understand the perspective of the employees in a better way.
Yeah. Well, this is great. I didn't, like I said, wanted to talk about some of the challenges, maybe some of the skeptics that people are going to bring up, but I don't want to leave it there. So we're going to talk about some of the benefits. Like, if you've put all this time in, it doesn't, like, the way you describe it, it's not a small effort. Like, again, you're not just putting numbers in a spreadsheet and then saying, like, oh, we did this work, like, here you can see it. Like, this is an intentional thing that you're putting hours of your weeks into.
Yep.
And so what has been, if we're talking finance, what is, like, the ROI, I guess, for ChartHop of doing this? What do you get as a company aside from just, like, more perspectives about how we're doing and how employees feel about it?
So I think there are sort of two key, and I'll start with maybe the more obvious one, is it just gives you a broader perspective around planning and more feedback, and so you can just make smarter decisions. And you have sort of that, like, next level sense of impact. So, okay, if we do this, yeah, I know what it's going to do, just kind of at the high level, but here's kind of the trickle down of that, and have a better sense of what the impact would be on the organization. I think the more important piece, though, is that it helps, I believe, with retention of employees, because they feel like they're at an organization where they are trusted with information that maybe in other organizations they may not be, and that their feedback is really being taken seriously. And that's valuable to everyone. You want to feel like you're being valued in an organization, that your opinion has merit, is being listened to. But not even just being listened to, it's being considered, and know that the management team is talking about it. And then that's a company that you want to stay with. I think we've been really successful in keeping our employees through what is historically a challenging employment environment in the last couple of years. It's really hard to find and retain talent, and I think we've done a really good job of that. And I think the transparency goes a long way in that.
Makes a ton of sense. I wanna follow up on that employee retention note, because my job is writing content, and so a lot of it is, like, finding stats to throw in, and there's a lot of, like, just general wisdom around certain numbers, and one of them is that it costs, like, what's the stats? Like, it costs 5 times more to hire and onboard a new employee than it is to, like, retain a new one. Or I think it's usually in the context of customers, but there is one that is similar for, like, employee retention versus churn. I'm curious what your experience has been. Like, what is the difference financially of kind of having really strong retention versus, if you're not transparent, you're kind of dealing with that constant revolving door?
Yeah, it's hard to put a number on because the roles are obviously very different.
Yeah, it's impossible.
And that sort of thing. But I think the way to look at it is, one, there's a cost of recruitment, which is just kind of understood. It takes a while to bring people on, so you have a gap in productivity, or there may be a function that's not being covered while you're looking to fill a role. I think if you lose people, institutional knowledge goes out the door. And that may be impossible to replace. Maybe things like, oh, well, so-and-so did this, and now no one's doing it, so we need to rebuild that again. And it's never quite rebuilt in the same way. It's never transferred and that sort of thing. And then I think there's a morale hit on teams also. When people leave, it's like, oh, that if you're in an organization where people generally really get along well, and because we are all remote, when we get together, it's there are real bonds that are formed. And when you lose people, you feel that. And so I think there are kind of a number of ways that retention sort of mitigates all of those issues and helps you grow faster. It helps you maintain that culture. It's the earliest employees that have been kind of living and breathing the culture since day one or day whatever. They continue to kind of spread that around the organization, and as an organization sort of cycles through employees, and you bring in new people who may have not been there for X event, or something that was done or said, or the way the product used to be, it kind of can share those stories. That all kind of becomes the fabric of the organization, and then if you cycle through people, that starts to really kind of get diluted. And so I think those are all ways that retention and keeping an org together and adding to it, really benefits the org financially because there are monetary costs to it, and then kind of that intangible way of kind of how are we maintaining culture? How are we continuing to sort of cultivate and enhance it really?
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad we spent this time discussing this
Yeah.
because it gets down to what you said at the beginning where finance is like being a more strategic partner. It's just really interesting to hear how finance can impact all of these things. It's not just, oh, employee retention makes, I don't know, X amount of dollars
Right.
saved over Y amount of time.
Right.
It's really thinking about the business and the health of it from, from the HR perspective, from the
Mhm.
people perspective, and also the financial perspective.
Yeah.
So really cool. I have a couple more questions. One of them is, you know, building a culture, not a static thing. So I know you're constantly working on
Yeah.
this. You have these weekly stand or all hands meetings. This is not something you just put in place today and it's all set tomorrow and for the next few years. So is there anything you're working on to continue to improve this culture of transparency at ChartHop? Any new projects coming up? Any things that are top of mind for you as you keep this going?
I think what we are constantly trying to do is finding ways for us to engage our employees and for our employees to sort of engage with each other. And that's largely born out of the fact that we are an all remote organization. Everyone's working from home. And so we do a lot around, again, employee engagement and making sure people are connecting, whether it's hopefully not on Zoom all the time, but finding people, in certain, is there a critical mass of people in certain cities? We do get the entire organization together for certain events, and it's really finding ways to make the most of that time and cultivating ways for people to just engage in ways that are beyond sort of their kind of everyday work responsibilities. And so whether it's kind of simple stuff and kind of obvious stuff like happy hours or whatever, or it's putting in place certain programs where you can nominate someone or for something they've done, and there's a gift they can get, and they can go do something with that. They
Nice.
feel really appreciated, and I think that's sort of what we try to do. We're always looking at new ways to do that. We also look at ways that we can engage with our communities as well, and so kind of get back. And so there's community service opportunities. We've done a number of different sort of donation matches and things like that. But it's really sort of taking it a step beyond just the actual core business and really building that sense of community both within the company and then also with our external communities as well.
Gotcha. Love all that. I think it's great. It's great to hear you talk about it. Like I said, just really gets to the heart of kind of the reason we wanted to put the show together. It's kind of getting
Mhm.
finance's role
Yeah,
to kind of move forward and to be about more than just financial modeling. Although all that stuff is really important.
it
But
is.
yeah, so really great. Love it. I have one last question. We're
Sure.
coming up. We've been talking for a bit, and I ask everyone that comes on. I say this every episode. People probably sick of this by now. I should stop saying it. But it's selfishly my favorite question because I'm not in a finance role, so
Mhm.
it kind of zooms us out and thinks about it in general. So last question is, what do you know now that maybe you wish you knew at the start of your career? Or what's one thing you know now that maybe you wish you knew at the start of your career? I'm
Yeah,
sure
no,
there's a lot of
it's a great
them.
question, and I think what I know now and what I think said at the beginning, and so it's moving finance from being that sort of very numbers focused and hardline sort of approach to one that takes into account the strategy of the business and all the constituencies, which really includes or is as a primary constituency is the employees. And I think that's sometimes overlooked because it can look at it like, oh, that's just a cost center. Well, no, it's not. That's actually the DNA of the company. People that are in it is the most important asset, and that ultimately is what drew me to ChartHop was kind of the philosophy and the approach of the product. It was very aligned with sort of how my view of finance and strategy sort of has evolved over time, and so it was a very good fit. And so that I think is what I wish I had known earlier. Might seem obvious to me now and to people now. I think things are also changing. The approach and the overall market is changing. Products like ChartHop exist, and so that's probably at least one of the things that I think about. It's like, oh, if I had known this before, there probably been some different decisions that would have been made.
Yeah.
But ultimately here we are, and it's an exciting time for it.
Yeah, love that. I think I usually say this. there's nothing you can do about what you thought in the past, but
Yeah.
I would love at some point to turn this same question that we ask into like a little career advice book for finance people or
Sure.
something.
Yeah,
Because there's obviously people coming up behind you that, if they can start out and they can know some of these things
definitely.
ahead of time, maybe they'll be in a better spot.
Yeah,
So love
absolutely.
that answer. I think it's a good one. But I wanna leave with one last thing, and just wanna say thank you again for joining, taking the time. I know the life of a CFO, it's not a quiet one. So just want to say thank you and wanted to give you a stage to let people know where they can connect with you, find out more about ChartHop, anything that you have for people to go find. Let them know.
Totally. Yeah. So for ChartHop first, it's charthop.com, CHARTHOP.com, and generally find me on LinkedIn as the CFO of ChartHop there.
Cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Appreciate you being here, and it's great to have you on the roll forward, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for checking out this episode of The Roll Forward. This show is powered by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow The Roll Forward wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Or visit mosaic.tech/podcast to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.